Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring the evolution of psychodynamic theory. With me is Dr. Adam Crabtree, who is a trainer of psychotherapists at the Center for Training in Psychotherapy in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, where he also has a private practice. Dr. Crabtree is the author of many books, including From Mesmer to Freud, Magnetic Sleep and the Roots of Psychological Healing. Some of his other titles include Evolutionary Love and the Ravages of Greed and Trance, Zero, Breaking the Spell of Conformity. In addition, he is the co-editor of a volume called Beyond Physicalism and co-author of Irreducible Mind. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
I hope I got all of those titles correct.
You got them right.
Okay. Yeah. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've known you for many, many years. And when we think about psychodynamic theory, most people would assume, it all began with Freud.
Yeah.
But in your work, you go back a couple hundred years before Freud to the fascinating figure in Western history, Franz Anton Mesmer.
Correct. Yes, I do, because, you see, when I began working in psychotherapy, after working about 10 years, I realized that there were a lot of things in my training, which is psychoanalysis, that really didn't explain very well things that I was actually coming across in people. So it made me go back to find out if there are people who did notice some of these things that seemed to be ignored by conventional psychoanalysis. And I went back first to about 100 years, but then I realized I had to go deeper into our culture, which is about 200 years ago, to Franz Anton Mesmer, who, in my opinion, began it all. It made it possible for us to have in our culture a view of the human psyche as being both having two minds, you might say, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And that's the psychodynamic approach. That's
what you mean by psychodynamic.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Mesmer himself coined the term animal magnetism.
Yes.
Which many people would say, that's all pseudoscience, there is no such thing. But he was talking about what people today often think of as subtle energies.
Yes. Energy healing in its forms today are very much like what Mesmer was doing. He, in that way, was the first in the West to do this, in the West. And there has been some question as to whether he was influenced by the East, which had such a concept much earlier.
Sure.
And we haven't been able to find any such influence yet, historically.
Well, didn't the ancient Greeks even talk about pneuma?
Yes, yes, they did. They talked about the spirit, the breath of life. Yeah. Yes, they did. But that didn't seem to be his starting point either. He seemed to be much more coming from the point of view of the physician, and he actually was a physician. He was trained as a physician, but he wasn't a philosopher. So those influences really didn't interest him.
Well, Mesmer attracted the attention of the nobility of Europe, I know that.
Yes, he did.
He was, people from high society flocked to receive his magnetic treatments.
They did, because anybody who's ill, particularly in those times, and now we're talking about the 1770s and 80s, you didn't have a lot of choices as to where you could get really good help if you were seriously ill. So many people from all castes and levels of culture came to him.
And I am under the impression that it became, well, two things. First of all, there were a predominance of women patients. to my understanding.
It seems that way, yes. Actually, some women became magnetizers later on, as they were called, but most of the people who were worked with were women, although not exclusively, by any means.
There was a tendency in those days for women to suffer from a condition known then as hysteria.
Well, yes, hysteria has always been around. It didn't come to be called that until quite a bit later. But he, in fact, considered everything from a physical point of view. He wasn't looking at it from a psychological point of view, so that his approach was to heal the person physically. And if they might have any problem psychologically, that would be automatically taken care of. It was his pupil, the Marquis de Puységur, who took things in a very different direction, in a psychological direction.
Well, it would be useful, I think, if we could paint a picture of what it was like in Mesmer's parlor when people came for treatment.
Well, when they came for treatment, they often, particularly when he was treating the poor, they would come in groups and they would sit around a tub that he had devised that had ground glass and metal filings and rods coming out, and he believed that these rods could be put against the ill part of the person's body and heal it, because he believed that there was such a thing as a kind of magnetic fluid that pervaded the universe, and that magnetic fluid is the fluid of life. Fluid basically could be translated as energy, the energy of life that's everywhere, and it flows through human beings and animals in a special way. It flows in a kind of pulsing way, and that flow of magnetic fluid through the body is what produces life, and when there are blocks to that flow, that's where illness develops. And he intended to break those blocks through his technique.
And how did the patients typically respond?
Well, they sometimes, there's a picture of this, by the way, that is an etching of this that I have. Sometimes the women, it's shown in the etching at least, would faint and have to be carried off to another room where they could recover. He had a kind of recovery room for them, and he believed that they were in a kind of healing crisis. They would come out of it and feel better. And any other experiences beside that? Well, he treated some people individually, and for that, in some cases, he had them come and stay in his home, like particularly with a young woman early in his practice. And he would see her every day and use his magnetic passes or movements of the hands over the body to try to bring her out of her state. She was a pianist, but she was blind. But the blindness, it seemed, was psychological. Not that he thought of it that way, because he wasn't really a psychological thinker. But he believed that it was some kind of a problem that could be solved through the application of animal magnetism. The problem is she was actually supported by the Empress at the time, and she was doing piano concerts. As he began to treat her and she began to see some, she wasn't as good a pianist. And this caused some trouble for the family, as you can imagine.
I see. Well, Mesmer became extremely well known for a while. So there were, I presume, many claims of miraculous healing.
It seems that way, yes, yes. Those in the early days are more just hearsay. We don't have written records of them. There are many written records later on, yes.
And at one point, a commission was formed, including the famous American statesman Benjamin Franklin.
Yes, that's true. The commission was to investigate whether the claims of Mesmer were correct and whether there was some reason to believe that he had discovered a method of healing that was really effective and legitimate. And that first commission, and the major commission, had as its member Benjamin Franklin, who was then the American ambassador to France. And so he took part in that.
And a scientifically minded individual.
Exactly. And all the people in that commission were supposed to look at it scientifically, to make their judgment according to the scientific approach.
Yeah. And I gather their conclusion was, if I recall, somewhat mixed.
Well, the conclusion was basically the commission agreed to say there is nothing here that is new, that there are maybe some healing effects that occur through the application of his technique, but that's probably through the imagination rather than the technique or the notion of magnetic fluid itself being the agent of the healing.
And now you mentioned Mesmer's student, who the Marquis Puisségur,
yes,
who carried on his work.
Yes. Now, this is a really important chapter for the history of psychotherapy and psychology generally in the West. That this man happened to come along. He was a marquis. He was in the aristocracy, and he decided he wanted to take, I suppose you would call it a seminar that Mesmer was teaching in Paris, to learn himself how to use Mesmer's technique. Mesmer charged a fee for the seminar, and you could go there and learn it and go off and practice. And so he did that. And he went back to his estate in Soissons, and he began using Mesmer's technique with the passes of the hands over the body to induce the flow of magnetic fluid. And the first person he encountered was one of the servants who lived there, a woman. She had a toothache. He used these passes. The toothache went away. So another woman who had a toothache heard about this and came over and got her treatment, and that toothache went away. Next, there was a young man named Victor on his estate who seemed to have, it looked like a flu from what we can tell in terms of the description of the illness. And they asked him if he could help Victor. So he applied these passes to Victor, and Puisségur was very observant. So he began seeing things about what was going on in the people who were being magnetized, as they called it, that Mesmer hadn't noticed. He saw changes in the way that he was personally, that is, Victor. His personality seemed different, and he did things that seemed surprising. For instance, at one point, Puisségur decided he would try to get him to work off the temperature that he had through sweating, and so he wanted to get him to dance, and he suggested that he was at a party and he should dance, and so he got up and began dancing and sweating and so forth. These are just techniques that came to Puisségur off the top of his head.
So he started working with suggestion.
Yep. So that was a suggestion. And then he discovered that he could think of different songs, and that this young man, Victor, would begin singing them without Puisségur saying anything to him about what the song was that he was thinking about.
As if there were a telepathic connection.
Exactly, that's right. And this didn't seem to surprise Puisségur that he could read his thoughts. That's the way he saw it, and he didn't seem to think that that was terribly unusual. And he also did things that allowed Victor to speak about his own illness, and he described his illness. And later on, as he continued to work with Victor, it turned out that Victor was able to describe the illnesses of other people and prescribe effective remedies for them. So that he seemed to have what we would today call a kind of medical clairvoyant ability.
Like Edgar Cayce.
Yeah, something like that.
In the U.S.
That's right. That's right. So that this was there were a whole set of things that were noticed by Puisségur that Mesmer had no idea about. He didn't think that the person who was being healed had to go into some kind of convulsive reaction as Mesmer thought. He could have a quiet crisis, as Puisségur said, and the healing would take place naturally that way.
And I presume he didn't necessarily have that big tub filled with iron filings.
No, he didn't. No, he believed in the fluid, the magnetic fluid, but he believed equally in the power of love. And he said that you have to love and will that the person get well through good feelings towards that person. That was part of it. Not that this meant that the magnetic fluid had no place, but he saw them as working together.
And if I recall, he seemed to feel that if the therapist or healer was a person who had no blocks to the magnetic fluid, then that would affect the person being healed and would help unblock them.
That's exactly right. The idea was to unblock their obstacles to the movement of magnetic fluid through the power of the movement of magnetic fluid through the body of the mesmerizer. And he believed, it was called mesmerizer later on, but he believed that if you were working as a healer and you weren't unblocked yourself, this could be very hard on you, drain you very badly. Whereas if the energy was moving freely through you, it didn't take that much out of you.
Which is very similar to how many energy healers work today. People who work in the Kundalini yoga arena with prana flowing through the various nadis and tubes, like energy tubes that pass through the body. They talk about blockages and the different chakras and the need to remove those blocks so that the prana or chi energy can flow smoothly through the body.
Yes, and this is an interesting thing. You talk about chi energy because as you know, that energy was something that had been worked with for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years in China, and used for healing in a very similar way that Mesmer did. The difference is that the difference between the East and the West here, well, first of all, let me say that it has been wondered whether Mesmer knew about the Eastern thought and used it, but no one yet has been able to find any historical connection between the two. But let me continue to say that when Psychodynamic came along and turned things towards the mental state of the individual and explored the mental state, seeing the physical healing as simply one aspect, but the mental became more central for Psychodynamic and those who read his works. So this was an important turn. You might call it a psychological turn in the approach to healing, which did not happen in the East. There was no turn towards the psychological in the East. It happened only there at that time. You can actually date it to 1784. And it changed the whole course of Western culture in terms of the way we understand the psyche. And it made possible, a century later, through developments that occurred, to actually develop a psychotherapy that's based on this notion of this complex psychology of the psyche. And basically that involves a sense that there is a conscious mind. If you take Victor, for instance, his first patient, the conscious mind was the Victor, and that he always knew. He was a peasant on the estate. He was not too bright in terms of aware of the subtleties of interactions and so forth. And when he put him into the state of magnetic sleep, as they called it, where he went into that altered state, he was very different personally. He became mentally much more active. He also was able to, he knew about all that Victor did in his ordinary state, but Victor, when he would come back to his usual ordinary everyday state, knew nothing about what happened when he was in the state of magnetic sleep.
No, this is interesting. It was called magnetic sleep, and I believe also the term somnambulism was coined by Psychodynamic.
It was, yes.
And yet, you're saying that Victor was more active in that state.
He was more active.
It's not as if he was asleep.
He was not asleep, and this is why calling it sleep was a bit of a misnomer. But he was comparing it to sleepwalking rather than to sleep when you're not moving. So he's saying it's like this was a sleepwalking person in a different state than he was in his ordinary life. On the other hand, he wasn't inert on the bed. He had some kind of consciousness, and you could communicate with him. And that consciousness was remarkably bright and also had some of these apparently paranormal capacities.
Well, we know that by the time of Sigmund Freud and some of his mentors like Breuer and Genet and so on, the term was hypnosis. Somehow we went from animal magnetism to hypnosis.
Yes.
How did that
Well,
happen?
that's part of the development that led to the possibility of psychotherapy of a psychodynamic kind. James Braid was a British physician from Manchester. And he was practicing in the 1840s. And by this time, mesmerism or animal magnetic practice was well known. It was being used by physicians and others everywhere in Europe and England. And so there were also people who were demonstrating the use of magnetic sleep or animal magnetism on stage. They would get subjects and have them go through certain things, and they would get these remarkable phenomenon from them. So Braid went to watch this. He thought, this is nonsense. This is just hokum, and the people who are watching are being fooled. So he went to one of these stage performances, and he went close to the action, and he saw that the phenomena were genuine. They weren't being fooled. There were real changes happening in these people. But he felt uneasy with the notion that this was being caused by a fluid, magnetic fluid, or as we would say, energy, being shot through them by the magnetizer. He wanted to come to a different way to understand this, one that he would feel more comfortable with. And he arrived at the explanation that what was happening here is that people would, who were on stage, were going into a state of kind of mental tension. And when the tension got too high, they just gave way and collapsed into a state of sleep. That was his explanation. And you could produce that by creating the tension, or you could produce it by suggestion. You could suggest they go to sleep, and they would go into that state. So he saw that state as purely psychological, with no physiological, no energy exchange involved at all. And that became the orthodox way of seeing magnetic sleep by the mid 1800s. It was the orthodox way, and people who were still practicing and talking about magnetic sleep and animal magnetism, they kept doing their work for several decades after that. But the world of physicians and the world of scientists tended to accept and feel comfortable with Braid's explanation and not comfortable with the other explanation.
I see. So hypnosis became accepted amongst a circle of professionals.
That's right. It was Braid who developed the term hypnosis, which simply refers to sleep. And that's just psychological, right? It has nothing else to it. Magnetic has some sort of, across a distance, action at a distance kind of.
Right. So, and then other physicians like Genet in France began using it as a form of psychotherapy.
Yes, and this took place over some period of time. There was a development that occurred in the mid-decades of the 19th century, in the 1800s, of coming to see that this other state, this other person, this second consciousness that Puissigir had discovered, and that we came to call the unconscious, that continued to exist even while the person was walking around in their ordinary state. In other words, it was existing as a parallel state all the time. It wasn't just that they were in their ordinary state, then the magnetizer put them in a different state, and that was gone, and then their ordinary state came back. They said, no, that was still there after the ordinary state came back. So to see that there's that continuity of the second self or the second consciousness or the unconscious was a big step that occurred around 1860 or 1870.
I see. Well,
and Genet inherited that.
Yeah, and he began a psychotherapy practice that eventually came to influence Freud.
It did. It did. Genet, in developing a psychotherapy, pointed out four different characteristics of this alternate consciousness that is continually with us, whether we're aware of it or not. One was that it's co-conscious. That is, it does exist while we are in our ordinary state. Another one was that it's aware of what's going on around. Even when you're in an ordinary state, this is still aware of all the action that's happening. Another one was that it has a mind of its own, and that it has intentions of its own, and these can be very, very different from that of the person in their ordinary state. So it's a kind of divided individual. And if you're going to work therapeutically with them, you've got to be able to communicate with that second consciousness, or what Genet called, and he developed this term, the subconscious.
The subconscious.
Yes.
Now, at around this time in 1882 in England, the Society for Psychical Research was formed.
Yes.
And as one of their goals, they set out to investigate this form of healing, animal magnetism or somnambulism or hypnosis. It was known by different names at the time. And they engaged in quite a few investigations concerning the paranormal aspects, but also theoretically.
They did. And to talk in any comprehensive way about this, I have to mention the name of Frederick Myers.
The famous author of Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, a great classic.
That's right. It is the classic in psychical research. He was a genius who did a lot to promote the existence of what today we call psychology as a science. He believed that psychology had to be a science. But he said that up to about 1870, people still had this notion that there's only one mind, that is, not the two minds that Pouchegir was talking about, and that one mind was consciousness, and we know all about it. Now, if we do things that we can't remember afterwards, or if it is possible, as seemed to be possible, that we can communicate with the person and they through automatic writing, and they don't remember doing the automatic writing afterwards, the only way to explain that is that there is this second consciousness that's mental, that has its own intentions, and that has its own ideas about the world and so forth. So he is the one who really developed that through his study of automatic writing, because that way he could actually directly communicate with that consciousness, and it was definitely, obviously, not the normal consciousness of the person. And so his idea of that second consciousness being more than just the physical brain of the person, affected Genet. Genet took that up, and Genet was a clinician, so he used these insights to develop a very effective psychotherapy of the subconscious.
Myers coined the term the subliminal mind, I
That's
believe.
right. That's what he coined because he thought of the human psyche as having what you would call a threshold between the conscious and the unconscious, or as he said, between the superliminal, what's above the threshold, and the subliminal, what's below the threshold. And for Myers, what is below the threshold is the vastly more important part of us. That our ordinary conscious mind, which is above the threshold of consciousness, is what we get along in the world with. It puts bacon on the table. It helps us relate to. It's the way we relate to people. It's the way we live our lives. But the great things that happen to us, the source of creativity, the source of paranormal experiences, the source of communications that go on outside of any knowledge of our own, takes place on the level of the subliminal self.
Now, Myers was also a colleague and had some influence on the thinking of William James, who is considered the founder of American psychology.
Yes, he was. They were actually good friends. William James was there when Myers died, actually in 1901. He was sitting with him. And James admired him tremendously. James talks about how influenced he was by this discovery of Myers, about that second self and the subliminal mind. They were friends, and they agreed on most everything in terms of psychology and in terms of the possible explanations of how paranormal phenomena develop in the subliminal self. So the influence is very direct there.
And this pretty much brings us to Freud and also his mentor, Joseph Breuer.
Yes, that's right. Now, the thing about Breuer knew about this whole magnetic sleep tradition and so forth, and so he was steeped in that history of 100 years. Freud knew nothing about it. And so Breuer brought to the Freud-Breuer relationship an important rootedness in that whole tradition.
Yeah.
But Freud kind of sidestepped it and went his own way. And although for a while he used hypnosis, which, as you say, the Society for Psychical Research experimented with and came out of the whole magnetic tradition, even though he used it, he didn't find that it was accomplishing for him in his psychotherapy what he wanted to accomplish. So it kind of fell by the wayside for him.
He developed the method of free association as an alternative.
As an alternative.
But which also seems to involve the trance state, not so different from hypnosis.
Absolutely. It is free association, in my opinion, is a trance state, and I might have a chance to talk about what I mean by that at another point. But yes, free association is, for me, a trance state, which means a person is in a state where they're focusing in such a way that things come from them, let's say from their unconscious, to deal with what they're focusing on, to give information, respond to what they're focusing on in a very genuine way, a way that tells you something about the individual or the person.
And it was really Freud who, I suppose, put the notion of the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind on the map.
Absolutely. He did. Now, he and Genet did not get along that well. Genet thought that he stole some of his ideas from him because he did, for a while, he was learning under Genet. Maybe there's something to that, but he did really develop it in a very different direction from Genet. He wasn't just a rehashed Genet. He had his own very original ideas about the unconscious, some of which I believe are problematic, but again, that's a different direction to go.
But so really one could say that Western civilization was sort of rocked by Freud. You see these influences. Well, it's not just Freud, it's the development of quantum physics and the development of modern art, all of these things that occurred in the early years of the 20th century. And Freud was central. I mean, even though Freud, I think, is largely ignored today in academic psychology, he's probably one of the 3 or 4 most influential people in 20th century Western culture.
There's no question about that. He has formed our culture in so many important ways, and you can see that anywhere you look, whether it's in popular, in the media, whether it's in literature, wherever you look, besides psychology. He is there in some form or other. It's my contention, however, this being very true, nevertheless, that whole thing could not have happened. Culture was really basically turned in a different direction for the West with Puisséguer's initial discovery, which then was expanded and explored.
More than 100 years before Freud.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, Adam Crabtree, this has been a fascinating discussion of some very important and overlooked history, and I'm especially grateful that we touched upon some of the paranormal aspects of the very early years of mesmerism and animal magnetism, and I hope we can, in a future interview, go into greater depth about that.
I'd love to.
Thank you so much for being with me.
Well, thank you for asking me to come.
And thank you for being with us. Thank you.